off, and
Sure,
I
let's
love
go.
to hear the chat and all the different languages. And yes, I'm a little intimidated myself.
Oh, my
But that's okay.
apologies. My
No, no,
apologies.
no. I'm in awe, right? So why don't we go ahead and get started? We have 115 people now. So this is an awesome turnout. Thank everyone. Thank you all for coming today. I think we have a great presentation today and conversation, right? So we'll spend a little time understanding Dr. Lewis Gordon, and then we will have a little conversation amongst ourselves to try and reflect on that and understand how that may apply to ourselves and our own lives and our own efforts. So with that, I want to introduce myself. My name's Doug Haig. I am the Executive Director of the School of Data Science. We are a new school at UNC Charlotte and are really happy to be able to host a series of webinars on the impacts and understanding society as it exists today, because data science sometimes, our practitioners don't always look up around the world. If we see a set of data, we'll dive in and start looking at it without understanding all the implications. And today is the day to look up and understand the world around us and really what we're doing. And I have a co-host today, and that is Gordon Hull, and I will turn it over to Gordon to help understand his area.
Yeah, so hi, I'm the director of the Ethics Center here and a professor in the philosophy department, and I won't take up any more time than just to say we have a couple of different series of webinars that the center is doing this year. One of them is on narratives around disability. The first speaker for that will be Rosemary Garland Thompson of Emory University on November 5th. And then there's 3 more talks coming up in the spring. And the second series is on equitable inclusion of minorities equitably in institutional research contexts. That was out of my colleague Lisa Rasmussen's work in citizen science initiatives. The first speaker for that one is Angelique Harding on October 6th. All of these are accessible through the center's webpage, which is ethics.uncc.edu, Instagram, or Facebook. And we look forward to seeing any and all of you there. Thanks. Doug?
Great, and with that, I'm going to turn it over to Joyce Dalsheim to introduce our speaker.
Okay. Well, let me just begin by thanking you, Doug and Gordon, and of course, thanks to the School of Data Science and the Center for Professional and Applied Ethics for sponsoring this talk. Welcome, everyone. I am so glad you could all make it. It is my great pleasure to introduce to you a scholar and public intellectual whom I greatly admire. I was lucky enough to meet Professor Gordon about a year ago at a conference at Bard College, and I am just so pleased that he is able to be here with us today. The new School of Data Science here at UNC Charlotte was launched this year, generating some interesting discussion in the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. Thinking about the influence of quantitative and statistical data and algorithms on our society, and big data in particular, raised numerous questions concerning the production of knowledge in general and our faith in and reliance on this kind of data in particular, including how such data affects our very humanness. We've invited Professor Gordon to initiate what we hope will be a longer conversation about the role of the university in knowledge production and the social and ethical questions that arise from the use of big data. Professor Gordon's broad areas of expertise situate him perfectly to begin this discussion with a focus on questions of racism in research. Lewis Gordon is a philosopher, political thinker, educator, and also a musician who holds a PhD in philosophy from Yale. But he is much more than that. He's been described as one of the most important philosophers of our time. His work spans a broad range of philosophical inquiry. These include, but are not limited to, Africana philosophy, social and political philosophy, philosophy of culture, race, and racism, as well as philosophy of education, science, and technology. He is an expert on the work of Frantz Fanon and is published widely in both academic and popular forums. As a public intellectual, Professor Gordon has written, lectured, and organized workshops and political meetings literally across the globe. He recently held visiting positions in Portugal, France, and England, and is honorary professor of humanities at Rhodes University in South Africa. Professor Gordon is currently professor and head of the philosophy department at the University of Connecticut at Storrs, where he also has a remarkable range of affiliations, including Judaic studies, Caribbean and Latinx studies, Asian and Asian American studies, women's, gender, and sexuality studies, and global studies. I cannot possibly list all his publications if we want to leave time for talk, nor can I adequately represent all his accomplishments, but I will tell you that 2 of his major works are about to come out in 25th anniversary editions. These are Bad Faith and Anti-Black Racism and Fanon and the Crisis of European Man. I will also tell you that despite suffering himself from the current coronavirus that plagues us, he also has a new book that is scheduled to be released in December, entitled Freedom, Justice, and Decolonization. I look forward to reading it. Professor Gordon is an outstanding scholar and a remarkable human being. We are honored to have him speak with us today. I've asked Professor Gordon to speak for about half an hour, and then we'll break up into smaller groups before we return for questions and answers and additional discussion. So now I turn the floor over to you, Professor Gordon. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for the invitation. Can everybody hear me okay? I just switched to a mic that functions good. It's functioning. Great. So I begin with Halito. Halito Chim Achokama. And if you're wondering what language that is, that's in Choctaw. And part of it, one of the reasons I prefer to begin with an indigenous language is because we're in the United States. And we're in a country where often we forget that the indigenous peoples are still here. And as an act of respect, I begin with using at least one of the language. No one can represent all, but at least there's the effort. I also mention a familiar language, Shalom. We just finished the Jewish high holidays. Assalamu alaikum. And Hotep, that's an ancient language that was spoken in East Africa called Medaneter, the earliest language spoken by our species. And Ujambo, which is Swahili for hello. In addition to that, of course, there's Buenos Dias. And you heard me speaking earlier when I mentioned Bon après-midi, which is just good afternoon. Okay, so I begin with that. And I also would like to say, not only thank you, Joyce, for the invitation to meet with the community, but also it's a delight to get to see some old friends, particularly in the philosophy department, people like Elizabeth Paquette. I was just speaking with Andrea Pitts, Eddie Souffran, and Sharon Sullivan. So it's great to see all of you. I also would like to give a hearty mazel tov or congratulations to this new school, data science. Congratulations. Okay, it's some of what I'll talk about will be related to not simply what the school is about, but the very fact that the school exists. Okay, and also thanks for the point about what I heard earlier about disabilities. What many people don't know about me is that I actually have multiple disabilities. And it's funny because given the way people look at me and my achievements, there's sometimes people like, come on, Louis, how in the world are you a person with disabilities? But I won't go through the long list, but some of the people know me very well, know that I do have disabilities that took the form of, for instance, not being able to drive for 3 years and many other issues that are connected to everything from blood to brain. But one of the things that people with disabilities know is to be disabled is not identical with being unable. And I found that my plight with disabilities all my life put me in a situation where, having recently dealt with COVID-19 and being one of the long haulers, one of the people who now have a whole set of other conditions that I'm facing, prepared me well to approach this added illness with the question of how to be functional. So in the end, a lot of people may not understand this, but people with disabilities, what many of us try to do is to do our best to be functional. Even when I was looking at the the simulacrum of a debate last night, a lot of people don't know, that Biden has a disability. He struggles with severe stuttering. And but of course, the cruelty of the moment is to try to reinterpret that in a form of intellectual deficiency, when there's nothing intellectually deficient about the man. So I just wanted to put that out there in this context. So to begin, there are lots of things I'd like to talk about, but I'll speak for half an hour. I'm going to begin first by raising the question of theory and myth. And I'm raising that question because many of us don't take the moment to reflect on how much the relationship between theory and myth plays a role in a lot of the issues we're going to deal with, including ethical issues around data science. And another way we often fail to think about relationship with theory of myth is precisely because we live today in a world in which we have universities. And when we think about universities, we think back all the way back to Plato's Academy. But a lot of us don't realize that Plato's Academy was actually named after a garden by a very famous individual in Athens. When Aristotle created his school, it was the Lyceum or Lyceum. But of course, you notice I said the word school, and you said the school of data science. And what many people don't realize is that the word school actually comes from the ancient Greek word skole. Among my disabilities also is stuttering, just to let you know. But anyway, skole, I remembered when I'd created a school in New York City called the Second Chance Program. It was a school for young people nobody wanted to teach. I always began with a conversation in schools. And it's striking that many of you here today and many people in our society spend their lives in schools more than in any other institution. But it's funny, few people have had a conversation on what a school is. And it was funny when I asked the students, the young people, what a school is, their answers were, of course, schools are boring. Schools suck. Schools are prisons. And they went on. And I said, can I add my 2 cents? And I said, well, the word school comes from the word skole. And they said, well, what does that mean? And I said, it means leisure time. And they're like, could you imagine telling a group of adolescents that it's leisure time? But from the ancient world, the idea was that most animals, most creatures are locked in a world of exigency, where you have to find food and avoid being food. And you spend all of your day trying to survive. But human beings have done something miraculous. Through the creation of language and culture, we have created whole mechanisms that afford us to spend a lot of our lives not simply trying to survive. And the question that follows from that now leisure time is, to what do you devote that time? Well, for many people in antiquity, and although I mentioned the Greeks, there are many societies among, for instance, the Incas, the Aztecs, if we deal with many ancient groups that understood this, we devote the time to doing uniquely human things. And I often point out to people that that's what school is. But the argument is that uniquely human things, devoting our time to that is to devote our time to acts of learning. And this endeavor, the act of learning, the argument for many people in antiquity was this act of learning is to learn actually how to become a human being, which is paradoxical because we're born human, yet at the same time, we have to learn to be human. So this connects then through a variety of issues all the way to today, because when I look at universities, and I don't like the term university, so one of the early terms I'll use is epistemoi or panepistemoi. And if you go to Greece today, you would see a sign, if you're looking for the university, it says panepistemoi. And pan, what the correct translation is pan-knowledges. So the problem with the university model, which we've inherited actually through Christianity, is that it was an effort to erase what they considered the pagan model, which is a meeting of different kinds of knowledge. And so in the panestemoi, or in the pan-knowledges environment, it means that we could look at what we call a pan-knowledge environment, or what we call a university or a school, as a learning community. And if you look at it as a learning community, it means that you have to look at people such as professors and students in very different ways. The way many people look at professors, for instance, and I always begin my classes with a conversation with students on what a professor is. Many students imagine professors to be like Moses with the tablets. But I usually point out that the way I look at a professor is as a person who fell in love with learning. And that love becomes so deep that we continue learning and we devote our time to learning for the rest of our life. In fact, research is actually our independent activity of continued learning. And sometimes we research together, again, communities of learning. Now, what this means for many of you who are students is that it means that as a student, you are actually, when you're working with professors, working with an advanced student. But that doesn't mean that you don't have something to offer. In fact, because your experiences are not identical with your professors, it means although you are new to what you're learning, your experience may orient you in such a way that you could contribute in such a way that the professor also learns. And I could tell you that every professor who is in this forum right now would probably agree with me when I say this, that we don't simply look forward to teaching you, we also every semester, every year, look forward to what we can learn from you. So this understanding of learning then is something that's ancient and profound. And this ancient and profound situation of learning, you could also understand in terms of how we understand two activities, two concepts that are going to play themselves out in what I talk about. The first one is theory. Now, today when you hear theory, if you go and look up the word theory in a dictionary, you'll see its origin is in the word theoria, which doesn't help you much. However, if you think about what the word theoria means, it's a very interesting story, because the word theoria is actually a conjunction of two words. One is an actual Greek word, but the other one, believe it or not, is actually an East African and West Asian word. And so the word theoria is actually a mixture of East Africa, West Asia, and Southern Europe. The theo part is from the ancient word stea, for Zdeos or Thea. And if you hear Theos, you know that means God. And the idea is that if you can see what God sees, you will have access to truth. But seeing what God sees is no easy task because we're human beings. And so with Thea, which is often translated also to see or to view, that word is connected to a word we use today in English called theater. Okay? You go to the theater and think about it. You go to a theater, you sit down and you want to see. And you look up at what's called the skena. The skena, which means stage, is from which we get the word today, scene. Okay? Each scene of a play. Now, what's striking is when you sit in the theater, at that moment, when the lights are off and your eyes are open, you don't see anything. And you see this point, your eyes could be open, but you don't see anything. You don't see anything until the stage is lit. And the lighting of the stage is from the ancient word or, which if you speak Hebrew, you know means light. So when the stage is lit, you can now see what has been what has been divulged or opened or appears. Now, what's important at this moment is although the stage may be there and you can see it, it doesn't, you now face a crisis. And the ancient word for crisis was krenain, and it means to decide. When you sit and look at what's before you, you must make a decision. And that means you're in a crisis. But the decision you have to make is rather striking, you see, because it's not simply a decision of what you're going to look at on the stage, but in making the decision, you now function as a krites, as a judge. So this moment, every act of seeing is accompanied by an ethical situation of making a decision, a choice. And this is an insight that's there, shared by many theorists, because they understand that the idea of theory without obligation, without ethics, doesn't quite work. As long as you make decisions, you face responsibility. So every theoretical act, every act of knowledge is accompanied by responsibility. Now, what's tricky is that with this responsibility, as many of you know, we live in a world that's been affected by the Euro-modern academy. And the Euro-modern academy is not hospitable to the idea of concepts like myths. In fact, we see a lot of what we do in our work as philosophers, as scientists, as researchers, as demythologizing. But the problem with that is many have not reflected on what myth is. And because it's a limited time, I'm just simply going to point out that the word myth is from the word mythos. And it is like, as it sounds, myth. It means from the mouth. And the idea is what is said from the mouth is narrated. And for many ancient people, from the mouth means through that activity, you derive meaning. And that's why myths are often repeated. They have to be narrated. They become ritualized because each narrative act is a production of meaning, re-meaning, and so forth. This is connected to something paradoxical in psychoanalysis because many of us are often looking for the original point of a meaning, but we don't realize that at an original point, that is not the meaning. It's the point at which we repeat it. It gathers the meaning. At the original point, it's actually unrecognizable. Now, this becomes something crucial, you see, because if we go back to theory, you notice all of the metaphors I used about theory were visual. But what happens if you can look and you can see without meaning? At that moment, your sight, what you see is empty. So one of the things that we have to take seriously is that although we may have this commitment to demythologizing, we might find ourselves in a situation where we're trying to produce a world in which we have a conception of rationality, theory, and seeing that is ultimately meaningless. We should think about what it is to develop a relationship to what we learn that is meaningful. And so those ethical considerations of decision means that we have to take seriously that we also have problematic myths against myths, when in fact the issue is to understand our myths and how they operate in how we produce meaning. So one of the things with data science that we have to deal with is the question of the very question of knowledge production. Now already I've been talking about knowledge production because as I've talked about these issues, whether it's the ancient academies or the very ancient humanity from 200,000 years ago, scratching out symbols and ideas, there's already at work two models of meaning that are going on, okay? So let me illustrate them allegorically. When we talk about knowledge production, the issue of knowledge production is pretty straightforward. One could just say it's about producing knowledge. But of course, if we just say that, that would be just like saying theory is like theoria. In other words, it doesn't really illuminate what we're trying to understand. So let's just start with two models that are very familiar. I'll be drinking a lot, mainly because one consequence of surviving COVID-19, especially if you had it as severely as I had, is you're perpetually thirsty. The first thing is many people look at knowledge in what I call the revelation model. And to understand this model, think of all of us as right now being in a very dark room. We're not even aware that each other's in the room. Well, if you can find a match and light it, now you have a little light, and you could see from that little light, you may see a candle, and you go over and light it. And eventually you could use that candle and get over to a light switch. And when you light it, you realize you're in a room with a lot of people, with a lot of objects, etc. So that's the old correspondence model of knowledge. In that model, what you're simply trying to do is to expand your vision to see what is already there, okay? But there's another model, and another model is the model of developing relationships through which meaning expands. And this comes back to what I was saying when I talked about theory, okay, and meaning. And myth. Because you see, even if you if you turn on the light, if you don't have an understanding of what people are, of what makes them meaningful, of what everything from a chair to whatever objects, and even beyond them, what is your relationship to them, then simply turning on the light won't make you aware or understand what is around you. Now, what's tricky about this expanded meaning, it means that this way of looking at knowledge is a lot like the way we think of the Big Bang. It's a kind of ever-expanding explosion of meaning. And what's sort of striking, and to understand this, it's important to understand a very simple, a very complicated, yet at the same time simple philosophical problem. The philosophical problem, the simple one, is that a lot of philosophy is dominated today by what we call ontology. And ontology is the study of being, what is there. However, the problem when we think about being is that many of us, because we think about being, we actually commit ourselves in advance to reducing reality to being. What if reality is greater than being? And in fact, there are many philosophers, not only Eastern philosophers such as Nishitani Kaiji, or in India, Surya Aurobindo, but also there are thinkers in Europe among the existentialists and others. There are Jewish thinkers, there are Christian thinkers, and many who realize that once you have a creature that exists, it by definition has stood out from being. And the moment you stand out from being, you now have to question your relationship to being, which means then that reality is greater than being. Nishitani put it beautifully. He says the problem with ontology is that it covers reality. Okay? Now, related to this are two competing metaphysical notions. Those who are obsessed with being tend to be obsessed with substance. And that's why they want to know what things are. They want to know what they are, as if they could exist completely independently of their relationship to other things. But another model is a relational metaphysics. And that's where we look at meaning as a relationship that produces other kinds of meaning. So what this comes down to is if you have something at your disposal, for instance, a datum, okay, a thing, an object, a knowledge object, that does not settle the question, because you now must ask, what is the relationship you have to that substance or knowledge object. And the moment that comes in, responsibility for that relationship and the possible kinds of meanings, which could be potentially infinite, would arise. Now, related to that are two competing models of knowledge with great ethical significance. What dominates a lot of the Euromodern academy, and unfortunately a lot of philosophy, is what I call the agonal model. And agonal, like agony, is the warrior model. That's where people come into the room and they see the work they do as a fight. And you could even see it in their language. They say they're going to knock down your argument, and your task is to defend your argument. You see that model? And some people, particularly in feminist theory, refer to this as the masculinist model. It's a model that's based on warriors and fighting and scarcity and who gets what, and it spills over to an academy that is connected to a whole lot of issues that I'm not going to talk about right now because it'll take too much time. But that's where people begin to do all kinds of horrible things, because after a while, when you're fighting like this, you're no longer concerned about truth and reality. You're just concerned about winning. And the problem, as we know with winning, and we saw some of this last night, is if you're obsessed with winning, you sacrifice truth and reality. To put differently, you can win a fight, but be dead wrong. So we think about another model. There's another model that starts with a premise of we, of communicating, in which the task is not to knock down people and to fight and win. The task is more to understand and to see what you failed to see before. That's the communicative model. It's a model where even you, in the act of even trying to explain what you have discovered, in the act of explaining it will discover new things. And the people with whom you're working to understand this thing that you're discovering may bring to it new relationships. And you begin, everybody as a community, to see, hear, smell, understand, think about things they've failed to think about before. So you could see how that's connected to the way I talked about a professor and a student earlier. So I'm going to close now with two things to consider given these premises. The first one is a concept from a book I wrote called Disciplinary Decadence. And although I wrote the book in 2000, the book came to print in 2006, it's ideas that go back to Phenomenal Crisis of European Man. And I'm just going to summarize them here to save time. The first concept is called disciplinary decadence. Disciplinary decadence is when you're so obsessed with your discipline that you confuse your discipline with reality. And what happens when people do this is they then develop what I call methodological fetishism. And we know this in the academy. This is where some people don't think about reality anymore. They only think about their disciplinary identity. And you know this when people say, as a philosopher, as a biologist, as a computer scientist, as an anthropologist, as a sociologist, as a. And then they start talking about the phenomenon. But then they sneak in there. The idea is if to talk as a sociologist, an anthropologist, a biologist, a philosopher, is actually to talk about all there is to talk about the phenomenon. And what this leads to is a situation in which they treat their discipline as if their discipline was created by a god instead of by human beings. This leads to a further problem. As we know, many people in many disciplines, when you write a piece of work or you go through a piece of research, there are people who are only obsessed with your method. In fact, there are people when they read your article or your paper, they're not interested in the results or what you say. They just want to see if you followed the orthodox method. And this method fetishism leads to the same problem of treating the discipline as a god, because as we know, if the method were created by a god that's omniscient and omnipotent, then all you have to do is know the method and you have the answers to everything. But the problem is our disciplines are created by human beings. The School of Data Science, as an example, is created by human beings, which means it has to deal with the relationship that the human beings who are looking at and producing data have to reality, and reality exceeds the data. Now, what I argue as a response to that is to take on what I call a teleological suspension of disciplinarity. Now, that sounds very ostentatious, but what it comes down to is this. It means to bring a form of humility in which you're willing to go beyond your discipline for the sake of reality. It's a form of fidelity through which your commitment to learn and continue learning means if the answer or the help is from something that's not within your discipline, you welcome it instead of eschewing it. And this leads to a communicative practice with other disciplines and the ongoing practice of learning with each other. So you could see already that point about ethics and communication that's at work. Now, this is something that was understood in a lot of Black thought, but this is not exclusive to Black thinkers. But I think it's very important to bring this up, especially as we're in a moment where there is a political assault on Black thinking, an assault on one of the things that come out of Black thought, critical race theory, and also just the ongoing effort to asphyxiate Black people. And what that insight is goes back to people such as Anthony Afremer in Haiti, W.B. Du Bois in the United States, Frantz Fanon in Martinique, but also some non-Black thinkers who are in conversation with Black thinkers, like Franz Boas in anthropology. And what the insight is this. They noticed that society has a way of mirroring this problem of disciplinary decadence. And I don't have time to elaborate it here, but it has the structure of a theodicy. And what that is that there's a danger of treating our society as if it's a god. And when we do this, we then lead to a theodicy of treating anything that contradicts the godlike status of the society as a form of evil that's to be expunged from the society. And an example of this, to make it very concrete for students, is an example I love to give. When Jean-Paul Sartre visited the United States, he met up with Richard Wright, and he went, and Richard Wright took him up to Harlem, and Jean-Paul Sartre asked, he said, "Richard, could you please tell me about the Black problem?" And Richard Wright said, "Black problem? There's no Black problem in the United States. There's a white problem. The racism against Black people." And this is what made Sartre say, he went back to Europe and said, the problem in Europe is not the Jewish problem. It's the anti-Semites problem. It's the people who hate Jews. But the insight there is that a society that is committed to denying its humanity constructs certain groups of people as problems. And as a consequence, that creates a double consciousness. The double consciousness that every Black person experiences, and this double consciousness is not exclusive to Black people, it's to Latinx people, it's to women, it's for anybody who's structured in a way that there is something wrong with them in the society. It means they learn to have two visions. One, what the society considers normal, and second, how the society perceives them as abnormal. Now, if they stop there, they're locked in what we call first stage double consciousness. However, if they get to that insight that Richard Wright had and W.B. Du Bois had, they say, wait a minute, the problem isn't that it's not us. The problem is a society that makes people into problems. And that we call potentiated double consciousness. It's a dialectical critique of a society that makes people into problems. Now, if we bring it back to the question of knowledge and data science, this is crucial because you see, if you are disciplinarily decadent, if people don't fit the expectations of your discipline or your theory, you make the mistake of declaring, my God, what's wrong with these people? When what you should be asking or considering, maybe there's something wrong with any kind of methodological framework that eliminates the ability to understand groups of people. What is crucial here, what's very crucial here then, is that it goes back to the insight from Du Bois. Du Bois argued that instead of making Black people into problems, perhaps we should ask ourselves if we recognize the humanity of Black people, to understand Black people as human beings who face problems. And this is an insight that spills beyond Black people, because as we see in the world today, there are many people who are not Black people who have taken to the streets to fight for democracy, to fight for humanity, precisely because they understand there's something wrong with a society that makes people into a problem to the point where there are representatives of it willing to put their knee on somebody's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds to wipe away the humanity of that person. But we need to understand at the level of how we produce knowledge that although that is not the physicality of doing that, forms of knowledge that asphyxiate our ability to develop the relationships through which to understand each other and to take the responsibility to build new forms of meaning can have similar consequences. And with that regard, I end. Thank you.
It's very strange to have that quiet moment where you can't hear the applause. So you have to pretend they're there.
Oh, that's fine. I'm more having the joy of the beautiful community in front of me.
Well, thank you so much for giving us so much food for thought in such a brief amount of time. We are about to move into small groups so that we have the opportunity to talk about some of this in smaller forums. One of the things I need to say before that happens is that those of you who have agreed to facilitate those small group discussions, please don't go when your computer prompts you to go into a small group. Don't answer that, just wait. And those people are, in case you don't remember who you are, Andrea Pitts, Gordon Hull, Shannon Sullivan, Mary Lou Maher, Dale Smith, Malin Pereira, and Eddie Souffrant, okay? So stay when everybody else goes into their breakout rooms. In the breakout rooms, please take the opportunity to think about what Dr. Gordon has said, and see how it applies to you, to your work, to your studies, to your teaching. And those of you who are the moderators, the facilitators, see if you can come up with a question or two to bring back to the large group. We have about 120 people here, or we did at some point. And so obviously not everybody is going to have the opportunity to ask a question. So if we can gather some questions together, and then we'll come back to the large group and have a chance to have a little bit more of a discussion. Okay, away you go, people.
Joyce, do you know about how long we're going to be in these groups?
About 20 minutes.
Okay, thank you.
So I guess we're the ones remaining.
Yes.
Okay, I'm going to start assigning the moderators to the individual rooms.
Could I ask a quick question? Just making sure I understand that in addition to promoting discussion, we're hoping to come away from our small group with 1 or 2 questions to ask Dr. Gordon?
If you can.
Okay.
If you can, yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Mary Lou Mahar, you look so familiar. We've met, haven't we?
Maybe. I can't remember why you're familiar, but yeah.
Until I got sick, I had a near eidetic memory. Eddie could attest to that. My memory used to go back to when I was 3 months. And then
Wow.
I got sick and it so messed up my brain. But the echoes of that, one of the difficult things is I had to train myself in how to function as a person with a compromised memory. But but before, people would be shocked because there are only two limitations to my memory, which is because I have dyslexia. Proper names would be difficult, and numbers because I would reverse the order. But visual things, I would meet people, say, oh yeah, 35 years ago, we had a conversation, you were wearing this, that, blah, blah, blah. I used to have, and it got creepy to people, you know. But the thing is, now it's compromised, but I know, you know that feeling you have that you've met.
Yes.
So you're having the same feeling. So you and I
I
must
have the same feeling, but I was born with the inability to make the other connection after
Still,
that feeling.
Still, I wasn't too off. I have a feeling, yeah, we've met. It's just,
We've met.
yeah, and once the mnemonic thing comes in, then it starts reconnecting synapses, and I would know. But for now, yeah. But it's good to meet you again.
Nice to meet you again. Thank you for your talk. It was amazing.
Oh, thank you.
So I'm now being invited to a breakout room with a different number. Is that the room we go to actually?
So now I think,
Joyce?
yes, I think now, yes, you are supposed to go and then, and get the conversation started. I think this is the IT person putting you in rooms.
But now I got another room number. So this is my third room number. First I was in breakout room 1, then 3, and now 7.
I must
Sorry
have-
to be confused, but
I must have clicked the wrong button. Sorry about that.
Okay.
so should we go now?
Yes.
Okay. See you later, everybody. Have fun.
Oh, so Joyce, it's just you and me.
Yes, I'm
Mhm.
staying. I have the, I think I have the ability to go from room to room.
Mhm.
So I can see how folks are doing.
Okay.
And
Let me briefly turn off
Excuse
something.
me. Excuse me. Whenever I got invited to a breakout room and I clicked join and it completely kicked me off. I don't know what to do about that.
I'll try to find you and add you to a breakout room.
Okay.
I have a list of about 100 and something people I'm trying to sort through. So,
oh,
Okay. Thank you.
Andrea, you didn't get, Andrea, you didn't get to a, oh,
This is Maria
Everybody-
Roseboro.
right, but just a second ago I saw Andrea again as well.
Hi, Maria Roseboro.
Hi, my name's actually Mariah.
Oh, well, hi. Oh,
Yeah.
wow. You know, you have the name Mariah. Well, Mariah was my great grandmother's name.
Oh, wow, really?
Yeah, she was from Shannon, Ireland. She was a Sephardic Jew from Shannon, Ireland.
Wow. My mother's side, we're Jewish, so
Ah,
yeah.
you know, I'm like a Jewish magnet. I tend to meet and connect, you know, because I know Jewish communities all over the world.
Mhm.
Everybody from Kaifeng to Cochin to, you know, varieties of Mizrahi. And I had a feeling with that name, Roseboro, because do you know why there's so many Jews with the name Rose at the end?
I do not actually.
Well, during the Inquisition in Iberia, many Jews up until the 15th century did not have last names.
Mm-hmm.
But because it was more the families and the groups you're connected to. And but when many people had to hide or go underground, the names, because a lot of the names were Hebrew names, would endanger the communities. So a code that many Jews did was to adapt a name that was based on adapt a botanical name, names based on flowers and plants. So that's why a lot of birches are Jews, and you know, or metals. That's why a lot of people with the name gold at the end are Jews. And then when they would travel to places, they would localize a name. So for instance, if you're first would be, say, Rose. And then if you go to Germany, it becomes Rosenberg or Rosenfeld or, and that process led. So I could often spot, and I noticed, I wasn't sure, that's why at first I said your name the way I did, but yeah, Mariah is the way we tend to say it. And that's because it's a variation with the ha on the end of Miriam.
Yeah.
And it goes back to not only salty tears, but also it's the basis of which to think of the ocean, salt water. And that's why Maria came from that name.
Oh, wow. That's very interesting.
Yeah. So that's why I had a feeling you were a Jewish person, but I did not want to be presumptuous. I didn't want to tell you what you were. So you informed me.
Yeah, I don't practice Judaism, but yeah, my mom's side and my grandpa were very heavily into it.
Well, there are many secular Jews. As we know, it's a Jewish people. You don't have to be a religious Jew to be a Jew.
Yeah.
And in fact, in my childhood, I did not practice because in the world I was in, there was no conversions. You were just born a Jew and that was the end of the story.
Yeah.
It's
kind of diverged into something different now.
Yeah, it's when I came to the United States, and a lot of things. The fortunate thing is because we lived as Jews, it was easy to practice Judaism because we were already doing those things. We just didn't call it religious. But it made it easier to understand because I already knew those things. You see?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's good to meet you at least auditorily, Mariah.
Yeah. Sorry, I wasn't expecting to turn my camera on or anything today, so.
I understand.
So you guys have been assigned to rooms, so if you want to join them, you can.
Okay, Mariah.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. And Katie Kessler, I think, is looking for a room too. Hi,
Yes,
Katie Kessler.
I just accidentally, I meant to unmute my mic in my breakout room and I hit the leave button because I am just that great at technology.
What room were you assigned to?
I was in breakout room 1.
Okay.
Thank you.
And then it looks like there's Carlos Cordero also.
Yes, he's been assigned to a room.
Okay. So I don't actually have, okay. So I can't actually go from room to room because I'm not the host, is that right?
Yeah, I can make you the host, but then that will make me not the host.
And then you won't be able to do anything, right? So that would probably be bad.
Yeah, if you want to, I can put you in a room. Just tell me which one.
Oh, I don't know. I just wanted to see how folks are doing. But I think it's okay for me to just wait. I'm sure they're doing great. And I wish I could be in every single conversation. That's what I do when I'm teaching and I have breakout rooms. I go from room to room and I listen a little bit to what folks are saying. Because the conversations are so much better when they're small groups.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. It's always funny when they don't realize I'm there at first.
But this week, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, no, go ahead. I'm impressed by how many people showed up to this event. I'm totally thrilled about that. When we have real live events, at least in my experience, it's sometimes really hard to get folks together. There's so many things going on. People are running in so many different directions. And so to get 120 some odd people, that's really wonderful. And I thought your talk was amazing. And
thank you.
I'm excited to hear what the data scientists think later when we have a chance to talk, sort of what it kind of meant to them. I thought it was just constructed so beautifully. For months already, I've been talking to the data scientists and using the term knowledge production. But I'm pretty sure I never managed to to communicate what it is I thought that meant. So now we have a whole new basis on which to discuss that, and that's just really, really lovely. So thank you.
I'm glad to hear.
Yeah.
I'm glad to hear. By the way, one of the virtues of being able to do things remotely is this has been an unusual high holy days, mainly because it meant I could be in more than one place at once.
Yeah. So where were you? Did you give a drash
Yeah.
or yeah?
Yeah. I could say, yeah. One of them is going to be published in Black Issues in Philosophy.
Okay.
And one of the reasons I decided it would be a good place for that is because right now I've been getting a lot of interviews from different Jewish organizations around not only Black Lives Matter, but also around anti-Semitism and all kinds of other issues.
Yeah.
And I've been pointing out that, the people who are killing a lot of Jews and a lot of Black people are white supremacists. I mean, yeah. I mean, there are designated white Jews who may say racist things about Black people, and there are Black people who may say anti-Semitic things, but those are saying things. But going into synagogues and shooting up people and planning and trying to get Israel to get to the point where Jesus is to come back and wipe all the Jewish people from the earth, that's not us.
That's different.
Yeah.
That is somebody else. That is a different group of people.
And then there's some I got to speak to, of course, to deal with the parts in the high holy days, to deal with people who have overcome severe illness and things like that. But some I pre-recorded. Others where I was sitting down because I have more than one laptop. Mm-hmm. And so I was attending to more than one shul at the same time. And but in a way, it was beautiful to just connect to so many communities. If you want, I could send you a link to one of those. I mean, their services are very long, but they're really interesting. Mm-hmm. It's a group called Jews in All Hues, and I'll send you by email. Theirs is in a link on Facebook, but they'll probably put it on YouTube eventually. And they're just gorgeous liturgies, and just because it's Jews from all over the world, from Korea, from people who are African, people who are Latin American, all the way through. Each did a portion, and it was just so beautiful to see. And just from very, very old Jewish community, also to people who just came to Judaism, all different kinds. And it was wonderful. And the cantor who organized it, she was just amazing, just absolutely amazing. So yeah, I could send you a link. It's something that would be, I think you would enjoy.
Yeah, I would love that. I think my son would also really like that. He has a nice congregation that he goes to in Philadelphia. He lives in West Philly, and he's totally.
Oh, which one?
Kol Tikva, I think it's called.
I've been there.
Yeah, have you?
Yeah. Well, I mean, you could imagine. I've been to.
You've been around.
Yeah, especially the Philly ones. I've been to Mikveh Israel, Bethel, the different ones that are there. Yeah.
Well, he's just a youngster. He's like 22 or something. And he's living in West Philly, and he's totally thrilled to be there because he spent some time in Senegal, which is actually where he met you.
Yeah.
And he learned to speak Wolof, and he learned to speak French, and so he just loves being in this community where he feels a little bit home away from home. He misses his friends in Dakar so badly. He just keeps trying to figure out a way to get back there.
Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, a lot of people here, when they talk about Africa, they don't, if more Americans would just go to places. I mean, Dakar is a particularly unusual city because you feel like you're in the movie Casablanca. It's just that everybody's dark skin. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It really does look like that.
I have to say that I think one of the really important experiences he had by going there was you know, to be so outstandingly white. My son is very pale. He's very pale. It turns red when it when it gets warm outside, you know. And so suddenly he was, you know, he was the very, very white person. And it's a new experience, and it's a good experience.
Yeah, it's
really
related
look
to what I was saying about language.
Yeah.
You know, to be in a language where you're not, as they say, the commander or the master is very healthy.
Yeah, that's right. So your name is Sean, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, I'm not good at remembering names.
That's okay. I'm not either.
Okay. So I'm thinking that they went into breakout rooms at around 4:50. Is that right?
I'm not sure. Sounds about right.
It was about
So
4:44.
Yeah, I do know that you had the conference scheduled to end on my schedule at 5. So,
I'm thinking, you know, give them another 5 or 6 minutes, like, so that we have a solid 20 minutes at the end for discussion.
okay.
It won't be enough, but it'll be a nice start.
Okay, so at 5:05?
Yeah, how about
Okay.
that?
Yeah, sounds good.
Yeah. I wrote down a question for you though, Louis, already.
That's fine.
My question.
Sure.
Maybe I can ask it real quick before the people show up. You
Sure.
were talking about relational metaphysics and about objects and things or people or whatever it is we study. And you suggested that we have a responsibility to that object, to that
relationship. Yeah.
to that relationship. So I'm wondering, what is the source of that responsibility? Where does that responsibility come from, and what does it encompass?
Quite a lot. In fact, I could give a whole course on it. But a hint of it is some of the ideas from Buber. But there's more than that. It's not only Buber, but many others. What comes from it is the fact that we are, by definition, the creatures that stand out from being. And that upsurge creates, this is one of the reasons why the mythical life of so many human communities, there's this concept of breaking or parting or coming from the womb, that kind of separation. But in it creates all kinds of possibilities. And the dialectical part of it is that we begin to realize that each time we reach back, we can reach back in many ways that reorient us, and we have different kinds of meanings. And this is the way for instance, the way I teach dialectics. I don't teach dialectics as thesis, synthesis, antithesis, because it takes the contingency out of dialectics.
Oh.
What I teach dialectics as is, for instance, the way I look at it this way is, if you discover that the world is bigger than your bedroom or your house, it doesn't follow that you'll open the door and walk in a linear way outside. You might think the door means you go up, down, sideways, whatever. And each moment of discovery creates new forms of meaning. And the other part, and there are a lot of other elements in there. For instance, there are many ways people study language, but they look at language from the outside. They look at, and what they fail to understand is that that language is a profoundly intimate activity. Because when you communicate with another, it's not only that they're there, but their words are actually in you. They're here as well. And for people, of course, you could see how it connects to psychoanalysis and also forms of feminist analysis. Men who want to see themselves as closed, for instance, they want to be the people who simply point at language, but they don't want language to come inside of them. And they don't want to deal with the enthusiasm of language. And so the language is a very erotic activity. And these are other elements that deal with relationality. So there are a lot of ways in which people try to expunge relationality from the world. But relationality is another way of saying connectivity, but not connectivity as one outside connected to another outside. It's more transcending than that.
So, I mean, when I heard you talking, I was thinking, you know, like scientific experiments where we sort of hold all else constant in order to study the one thing, and how many problems arise as a result of that, how much we are really unable to understand even as we think we're gaining understanding.
Sure, and those old ways of looking at science, which is very macro oriented.
Yeah.
Look what happened to them when they began to think of quanta, and they realized what happens with a photon.
Okay.
Because the whole point about a photon is the question to locate it.
Yeah.
Always raises a problem, because ultimately when we're thinking of stuff like consciousness, for instance, we're really dealing with it at a quantum level. And at the quantum level, there's always contingency and uncertainty. This is why at the macro level, human communities seem predictable. But at the quantum lived level, there's always contingency and freedom.
Yeah, the beauty of the relationship between physics and theory, you know, social theory, critical theory, high theory is just fabulous. But I could go on talking to you for hours, but it looks to me like we have our people back. And so, I mean, I don't really have a special order in which to do this, but since I did ask the group leaders to try to gather a few questions, maybe some of those group leaders would be willing to start the conversation. I mean, if you want, I'll call on you, but that's a little weird.
Well, Joyce,
Yeah.
we thought it, not we, maybe I did. I thought it most appropriate that one of the students in our group sort of
Okay.
jump in with a question.
So Dale, you gave a student the opportunity to ask a question?
I guess you could call it an opportunity.
Okay, so we'll have Dale's student go first.
Hi, my name is Chloe. In our breakout room, we talked a lot about the obsession that Dr. Gordon mentioned with your discipline, and like kind of that fetish that your discipline is, you know, perfect, and you're kind of afraid to, or don't know how, maybe to reach out to other disciplines and kind of engage in that interdisciplinary work. And so the question that we wanted to pose as a group was, how can students break that cycle? Since many universities operate in that way, how can students get involved in interdisciplinary research when often being able to do research is based on your major? When I did a research program this summer, I could usually only apply to political science research positions as a political science major. So that's our question for you.
Thank you much. Thank you, Chloe. Could the others who have questions as well, since we have a short time, because even if I don't get to answer them all, I think you can learn from each other by hearing the questions. So could all the questions come?
Sure.
Yeah.
Andrea, are you going to speak for your group, or do you have someone who's speaking for your group?
I was actually in Chloe's group.
Oh, you were in Chloe's group.
Yes.
Okay. So Gordon Hall, your group.
Yeah, sure. Apparently I'm speaking for them, but we were talking about engineering and licensing, and one of the students said, you know, engineers do a great job learning how to build a safe bridge, but we're not taught how to think about who is this bridge for, what kind of traffic is designed for it, you know, is it being used for nefarious urban planning, like they built, you know, broke up urban neighborhoods in the 50s and so on. And so the question becomes, well, we in the academy aren't doing a very good job in training ourselves and our students how to think about those kinds of questions. And how could we do better?
Okay. Shannon Sullivan, your group?
Yeah, I just, well, we sort of talked about relational knowledge. We didn't talk about fridges. We talked about trees and sort of their relationship with birds and soil a little bit. But then we also, maybe more specific questions, we wanted to hear more about Du Bois's concept of double consciousness and how maybe that related to issues of bias or how we see things when we're doing data science or other kinds of knowledge projects.
Excellent. Mary Lou Maher, do you want to tell us a question from your group?
Yeah, so I didn't assign anyone to ask a question, but we did come up with several. So I'm going to point out one verbally, but the others in my group, please type them in the chat window of the question that we discussed that you wanted to be spoken, didn't get spoken. But one question was, you know, where really does data science fit in this discussion? Is it the villain or is it the hero, so to speak? Is it the one that's putting the foot on the neck of the black man, or is it the opportunity to go beyond being and into the reality? And a follow-up on that is the approach that we're taking here, which is a multidisciplinary approach to put philosophers and data scientists together in the same classroom, in providing that kind of a role model for our students. Is this a more complete picture of reality, or will we again fall into that trap of disciplinarity?
Okay. Eddie Souffrant, I don't see you, but I imagine you're here somewhere.
Yes, I am.
Oh, there you are.
Yes. Quick thing. I didn't get an opportunity to thank my group because we closed in and we were kicked out. So I enjoyed very much the conversation. And that's all I wanted to say here, but I wanted to cede the mic to at least two representatives of the groups, Abigail and Summer, and they can ask the questions that they were raising in our conversation.
Okay.
I was wondering about the warrior approach. If you think sometimes it might be necessary, we were talking about it in an aspect of certain disciplines, like how I'm a civil engineering major, and sometimes I feel like, you know, we're all against each other, who can be the best, who can get the best grades, and like sort of who comes out on top. And if that might be necessary in some majors, just to make sure you have the foundation and the information that you need.
Okay. And Malin, did you have questions from your, oh, Eddie, was there someone else in your?
Yes, Abigail, there were some others, but these were the two, and Abigail had a question.
Okay.
Yes, I found it interesting, Dr. Gordon's comment about school in Greek being, meaning leisure time. So I didn't know if you could speak about if there was like a leisurely component in all of the fields that one can go into, or is it more of a cycle where you begin your research and your education and then the leisurely component comes later on?
Okay. And now Malin, anything from your group?
Yes, we had an extended conversation around the idea of the knowledge being about developing relationships in which meaning expands, that Big Bang theory, and many students didn't feel like that's what it felt like, particularly in the first couple of years of their curriculum, especially in STEM. There seems to be this baseline content knowledge that is required, and they feel like they're being told, you know, a lot of things. And we wondered around, you know, maybe there's sort of a, you know, a common language that has to develop before everybody can be in the same learning community and learning together. But the question then came down to how oftentimes, until you develop a certain level of knowledge, baseline knowledge, you don't have the status to be in the conversation, and often are made to feel like, you know, the deficit model, like you're somehow deficient or ignorant. And they wonder how can we get past that in higher education, because certainly the students themselves recognized that they needed to learn certain things in order to be conversant in the discipline, but they don't feel particularly good as they're coming to that knowledge.
Thank you all for the wonderful questions. And I don't mean that perfunctorily. One of the things I can't stand, it's become convention for people always to say to people they had good questions. and one of the things, some of the people who have known me for a long time is I don't have that kind of censor. So it's one of those things, if I really appreciate these questions. These are very good questions, okay? The first thing I'd like to say is, again, thank you all for being here and devoting your time for this meeting. And some of the things I'm going to say are going to connect some of your questions, okay? The first one, I'd like to say right away. A lot of times these days, science fiction is very popular, but a lot of people, when they talk about science fiction, they're really talking about technology fiction. In other words, really excellent science fiction enables you to learn more about science in the actual fiction. So if you think about television series, for instance, a lot of Star Trek is not science fiction. That's technology fiction about warfare in space. And you don't, in other words, get illuminated around the technology when you see it. But if you see the television series Doctor Who, that's very different. And as many of you know, the Doctor right now is a woman, and it turns out her very ancient version was a woman as well. And she actually explores the science through which the technology makes sense. There are many people, as we know, who know how to use technology, but they don't understand the science around it. Now, why I bring that up is because, connected to some of the questions, right now we are using a technology. We're using Zoom, but ultimately we're working through a form of virtual media. And this technology was not developed actually for the purpose we're using it. It was developed originally, particularly around social media, to use the metaphors, the allegories, the ways of understanding the world that the people who developed it had, which was involved in, for instance, exploiting the information they could get from us. And they expected us to use it, say the way Facebook was, to talk just about ourselves, etc. However, the pandemic, the social pressures it created a situation in which we had to be physically distant. And one of the things is, unfortunately, the language is dominated by neoliberalism, and neoliberalism is actually antisocial. So neoliberalism says we have to be socially distant, but that is absolutely false. We need to be physically distant, but as human beings, we need to be socially close. So it meant that these technologies that were actually designed more for the narcissistic, individualistic oriented model of the self began to be transformed as the self realizes that it needs other selves. And so many of us have been socializing, and we're using these technologies in ways that many people, and we have no idea where this is going to go, in ways that many of us didn't anticipate. So that's an example of the way, for instance, I was talking about how new relationships develop new kinds of meaning, because it means the technologies will have to adapt. And some of you may use Teams, for instance, and Teams is a wonderful technology that functions more like virtual offices, office spaces, and ongoing communication. And so it means then that we now have the capacity as human beings to transform these physical technologies into actual socially connected ones, okay? The second point I'd like to bring up is the distinction between an exclusive disjunction, that's where you say either one or the other, but not both, and a dialectical one that can actually think about both and. The reason that's important is because positivism tends to be dominated by the exclusive disjunction. And positivism is what dominates a lot of the conceptions of science we've inherited, and even the way we think about technologies. But the thing about that that's problematic is that it makes you think immediately about what to eliminate than what to develop a relationship to. I'll give you an example. Many students, when they take my classes, they're always surprised that they have to read so many books and so many articles. And I explain to them, that's because you've never read a philosophy book. I've never read a philosophy book. I've never read any excellent theoretical book. I am reading them. You see the difference? So it means no matter how much you try, it means anything you have picked up, the conversation with that text continues into your other texts, and it may lead you to revisit them. And this understanding that you're developing ongoing relationships to texts, to conversations, to your fellow students, that model is not the exclusive disjunction model. It's the constantly ongoing expanded relationships to other relationships model. Now this, if we think about it in the context of something like what Chloe brought up, if we think about it in the context of something like when you're doing a major, this is related. Before you think of your major, think about the mistaken way many of us think of language. Many people think of language as a kind of vessel, as a kind of thing you have, you possess. But it leads to a very problematic view of language because we tend to treat our language as if it is complete or a thing. When what actually goes on with language is developing a function, a relationship that enables you to learn language at all. What this means then is that if you pick, say, English, most people who speak English mistakenly think if they're going to learn another language, they have to find all the isomorphisms. In other words, the one-to-one relationship between words in English and words in the other language. But anyone who's multilingual will tell you that's the wrong way to do it. Because what you will soon discover is that there are words in different languages that have no equivalent in your base language. Now, what's striking here is the old model of how to think of ourselves would mean that we can't learn the other language. You see? But that is absolutely false. What happens is you just simply learn the new words and the new syntax and the new ways. And at first, you don't know what the hell you're talking about. But the usage, though, like the way I talked about myth, eventually you begin to learn the meanings. You see? And some of us have an advantage because in childhood, we were multilinguals. And some of us, we have the advantage. For instance, in my case, I had the good fortune because my paternal side of my family is Chinese. And because those relatives were from Guangdong, China, in my childhood, when I was a little baby boy, not only did I learn Jamaican patois, but I also spoke Cantonese. So it meant that the synaptical functions in my brain can make me hear sounds that many English speakers cannot hear, you see? But it means then I can learn other languages, other sounds. Well, similarly, if we move away from the language analogy to the discipline analogy, of course it's important for you to start in a discipline of some kind. The mistake is to treat the discipline as a silo. If you look at your discipline as an opportunity to communicate with other disciplines, with other people, the way I just talked about language, then you, even at the beginning stages as a student, can expand your horizon and learn more. In other words, what you're really learning in your disciplines is not simply a set of what Paulo Freire called bank account models of knowledge, a set of information. Instead, what you're learning is a mode of communicating and growing that transcends that. In other words, you're learning how to learn. And so when I talked about disciplines before, the idea wasn't that we should chuck disciplines, that we should get rid of them. The idea was about developing a healthier relationship to them. And so if you're willing to go beyond your discipline for the sake of reality, it's a lot like the way I talked about reading texts. It's not that you read this one, now you've dropped it and you go to another. That other text is still with you. Your discipline is what helps you to learn other disciplines. It's a transdisciplinary communicative relationship. And so one of the things I always advise students, there are three things I always advise students, right? Beyond that spiel I gave about learning, etc. I always advise students to have not simply a major, but also a minor or another major. Because it takes away the kind of reductive thinking of thinking in a very unicentric way about ideas. The other thing I always advise students is to travel, and don't simply travel to a place that is your language. Travel to a place that really, really puts you into the unfamiliar, because you'd have to develop a set of skills to bring something to the unfamiliar and learn how to learn from the unfamiliar, how to grow, okay? Now, this connects a lot with some of the questions about data science, because you see, the thing is, the old positivistic models of data science think of data as simply like a collection. They think of data in the way that a person who think of the old model of reading will think of the books behind me as complete texts, as things, and you collect them, and they're very finite forms of knowledge. But I just described that any random book you pick up on this shelf behind me is a text to which you keep returning, and you develop new relationships to them. One of the striking things about being willing to go beyond one's discipline for the sake of reality is that one may find that one develops a new discipline. A lot of the disciplines we study today didn't always exist. I remember when I was teaching at Brown and I had to go to talk about a tenure and promotion case, I bumped into a professor at who was the chair of computer science. And at that time I was the chair of Africana Studies. I'm the head of philosophy now, and I've been head of, I've created institutes and other things, but at that time I was the chair of Africana Studies, and they had, the chair of computer science says, oh, Africana Studies, so how long has that been around? And I looked at him, I said, I think a little longer than computer science. And you could see the point. The point is, when we develop a decadent relationship to our discipline, we forget our discipline once didn't exist. It came out of other disciplines. Computer science actually came out of something completely different. It came out of the complete creativity of a woman by the name of Ida Lovelace, who was in her effort to try to clarify a point when she was being, when she was supposed to just dictate the ideas of another mathematician, came across a problem and realized that he was not able to resolve it unless you think differently. And so in her mind, she said, what if I had an engine that could think? So she didn't use the term computer, but then she wrote an algorithm for it. And that's the algorithm that's the basis of how we eventually had computer science. A lot of us, when we think about wireless technology today, we don't think of the fact that the algorithm and the development of how we are able to have this is from a woman by the name of Hadi Lamar. She was a Jewish woman who was only known for her beauty because she was a Hollywood actress. Nobody knew that this woman who was just looked at as a beauty and a doll was actually inventing wireless technology in computer science, and she worked for the military, which meant that the military, everything she did had to be kept top secret. And so today, a lot of people don't realize the fact that this woman didn't say, I am an actor, end of story. She followed her pursuit and her creativity and developed these ideas. And you could see a pattern evolving here as I tell these stories. Because when we come to a point where we're asking the right questions, in every limit we find is an opportunity to develop something new and creative. And so the thing is to not look at data science as closed, but to look at it in a way that reinvigorates. We need to think of the understanding of science that's involved in our understanding of data. And as we begin to think that critical question, that begins to bring more to the fore. I'll be there in a minute, Yash. I see Yash Tademala's hand is up. And as we think through these ideas, we begin to think about, for instance, this is why I made the move from double consciousness to potentiated double consciousness. Because if you think about it, what Du Bois, when he saw this problem, Du Bois was a person who had an undergraduate degree in philosophy, got his PhD in history. He also did a doctorate in economics from Berlin, but that's a whole other story. There was a complicated reason why he got it later. But he began to realize when he was studying the slave trade that there was something wrong in what he was doing. And what made it even more so was when he took on at the invitation at the American Academy of Political and Social Science in the University of Pennsylvania to study the local Black populations there. It was clear that he was invited to do what racism wanted. It's used to a pattern that what racism wanted him to be was a Black guy who comes and go into Black communities that whites were afraid to go into and come out with a report on the pathologies of Black people. In other words, the rationalization of why you should have the segregation of Black people from others. But what Du Bois saw it as an opportunity, he realized, and he said to himself something that was a profound humility that many people don't understand today. He said, although he's a Black person, it doesn't follow that he knew Black people from the perspective of what it is to understand Black people from a proper science. And so he had to question his knowledge as a Black person of Black communities. And he walked into those communities with humility and began to develop new questions, and that would emerge if he didn't look at them as the problem, but to study the problems they faced. And through it, Du Bois developed a whole kinds of techniques from new methods from he was actually the true, I don't like to use the word father for a lot of reasons, more complicated, but of American sociology, because he began to realize, he developed not only quantitative analysis, he began to look at what it is to have a social world. And in fact, when you study much of sociology, you hear that the fathers of sociology are Marx, Durkheim, and Weber. But the fact is, the way sociology and a lot of ethnography is practiced in the United States in anthropology, it actually comes out of Du Bois. So the double consciousness here moved into potentiated double consciousness, and through it produced a different kind of social science, which today we just simply call sociology. But he did it very differently. Most people who do sociology today do it more like the way Du Bois did it than the way Max Weber, Marx, or Durkheim did it. But there are many other examples, because again, we're running out of time, but Franz Boas was similar. Franz Boas was actually a trained physicist. And one of the funny things is, get this, he wrote his dissertation on the color of water. Try to imagine this. And he began to realize the problem in trying to talk about the color of water. And this led, that's a whole, I could give a whole lecture on Franz Boas, but it led to him begin to think about our relationship to color. And this led to him working with Laplanders and et cetera. And when he came to the United States, he saw this in race and racism, and became one of the people who gave one of the ongoing systematic critiques of racism and concepts of race. And he was also one of the people who led to a different way of looking at African history. But you could see in each case, by asking the question of real science, is to figure out what is the right question to ask that would make you learn things you failed to see before. And so if we come to some of the other questions that were being raised, it means there should be the spirit of ongoing learning. I really encourage you to understand not only that you learn together from your peers, but you could look at the entire world as an opportunity of continued learning. And what you bring to that, who says the sciences we have now are all there is? The very fact that a school of data science is created would mean that it's going to encounter all kinds of conundra that may stimulate new kinds of questions that may lead to new kinds of ideas. And there's a lot more I could say on this. So many of you do feel free to write me by email, because I know that we were supposed to stop at 5:30, but I hope just at least this touched upon and give a framework through which you can converse with each other and illuminate these ideas. Okay.
Thank you so much, Professor Gordon. This has been amazing, and I heard brief bits from different people in different rooms that they had really wonderful discussions, and so that's a really great thing. Thank you to everyone for joining us today, and I hope you will join us in future events sponsored either by the Center for Ethics or by the Data Science, the School of Data Science. I think we have a talk coming up really soon. Sorry, that's my dog.
Hello, dog.
If you go to the website, you'll see everything. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you for participating. I really, honestly, sincerely hope this is just the very beginning of a much longer and broader conversation. And we will do our best to facilitate that conversation in future meetings and in our classes. Of course, thank you again, Professor Lewis, for joining us.
And thank you all. Keep the conversation going, okay? This It's a crucial element of what you're doing. And as I say these days, continue being safe, healthy, but do remember, find moments of joy. That reminds you of your humanity. Okay? Okay. So take care, everybody.